You don't want to demonize people who vote for one side or the other, but you also want to call out things that are actually wrong, right? So demonizing migrants and refugees, calling them animals. There are certain Christian values: love, forgiveness, charity, welcoming the stranger. Sorry, you don't like it, take it up with Jesus.
Hello and welcome to The Sacred. My name is Elizabeth Oldfield, and this is a podcast about the deep values of those shaping our common life. Every episode, I speak to someone who has some kind of public voice or platform from a really wide range of different political, metaphysical, and professional perspectives. My guest today is Father James Martin S.J., who is a Jesuit priest, editor of America Magazine, and author of many best-selling books on Ignatian spirituality, the saints, and Jesus. I really hope you enjoy our conversation. Father James, we're going to kick off with a question that you can really take in any direction you like. For people who aren't coming from a religious perspective, it's often more about their deep values and principles. I'm trying to get a sense of what you would like to be orientating you in your life. So I'm going to ask, what is sacred to you?
Oh, gosh. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. It's a real honor. What is sacred to me? I'm a Jesuit, and one of our mottos is finding God in all things. And so I guess I could say everything really is sacred. That doesn't mean every act is sacred, but, every person you meet is sacred. I think everything that's created by God is sacred. But, in my life, the sacred is really focused around Jesus. That's what the heart of my spiritual life is about. So I would say in my life, it's not so much what is sacred, but who is sacred. And that would be, for me, Jesus.
For someone who that's not their tradition, honestly, the question that comes up is, what does that mean? What does it look like for you?
I know. It is kind of crazy. So what does that mean? So there's two ways of answering that question. So as I said, I'm a Jesuit, and one of our mottos is finding God in all things. And that means that God can be found not just in reading the Bible or doing good works or going to church or praying, but in relationships and family and work and nature and art, which is really a very capacious spirituality. That's the first thing that I mean when I talk about the sacred. But the center of my faith is really focused on Jesus. Now, what does that mean? You're right, that can be vague. So it means Jesus, as we meet Jesus in the Gospels, Jesus' actions, his words, and his deeds. But we also believe that Jesus has risen from the dead and is present to us through the Holy Spirit. And so is through the Spirit, sort of leading us to do good things. We find Jesus in the church and in the sacraments. So there's all sorts of ways of encountering Jesus. I would say that when I hear sacred, those are the two things that come up. Finding God in all things, the sacred in everyday life, and also the person of Jesus. That's how I would answer that question, for me at least.
Yeah. Can you think of a moment in your life when, I guess, those sacred things have been tested? I often think we're not sure what are the things we're trying to live by sometimes until these moments of challenge or moral profundity or the temptation to compromise, when we're at a fork in the road and our life could go one way or the other. Can you think of a moment where they have guided you? And sometimes we fail, so you might not have chosen what you would have wished to at the time, but does anything come to mind?
I think just things recently, my own life. One of the things that's helpful to understand is we Jesuits talk about, this is going to sound like a very strange term, discernment of spirits, which sounds like there's like ghosts flying around. But it basically means that there are impulses, movements. When I say voices, I don't mean actually hearing voices, but, movements within you, voices that pull you one way or another. And there are impulses and movements and voices that pull us towards God, right? The charitable, loving, hopeful impulses, and ones that move us away from God, selfish, mean-spirited, despairing. And what we talk about in the Jesuits is not only that God wants us to make good decisions, but God helps us to make good decisions through what we call discernment of spirits. In other words, you can kind of gauge within yourself what's coming from God and what's not coming from God. And recently I was in a situation, I don't want to get too detailed, where I just felt really despairing and kind of miserable and turned in on myself. And I just, thanks to discernment of spirits, said, this is clearly not coming from God. I often use the example these days, thank God we're more or less past it, of the pandemic. And people were so despairing, right? Nothing will change. I'm sure you've maybe you experienced it personally or you knew people who were like this. And the shorthand was, for me, that despair is never coming from God. It just isn't. And hope is really always coming from God. That doesn't mean everything's always going to be perfect and, sunshine and lollipops and rainbows, but the feelings of despair are not feelings to follow. So that's how in the Jesuits, we discern which way to go.
Yeah, thank you. I'd love to get a sense of your story. Could you paint me a picture of you as maybe, we'd call it primary school age, I guess kind of 8, 9, 10. What was your world? And particularly, what were the big ideas that have been formative on your later life?
Well, I'm laughing because I'm writing a memoir now about just that, which is tons of fun. And so I'm sort of living in that world. I'm laughing not at your question. It's a great question. I think of like big ideas as an 8-year-old. It was, how am I going to do on my math test? And
how much sugar am I allowed?
And, what TV shows can I watch? I grew up outside of Philadelphia in a suburban town. It was if you're familiar with this TV show, very Brady Bunch kind of a lifestyle in the suburbs, middle class, not particularly religious. My family wasn't super religious. Well, we were Catholic, but, went to public school. Now, I know that means something different over there in the UK, meaning not a private school. Not paid, thank you. And so I was just this kind of average kid biking to school and working hard, and I was good in school and wasn't really thinking about much else other than doing well in school and friends. That was really important to me, having friends and being cool. When I was a young person, that was, I think, the focus of my life. How do I get people to like me? How can I be cool? How can I be in the in crowd? And, eventually that's kind of paralyzing because you can't, if you're just dependent on what other people think of you, you don't have any real freedom. I mean, that took me a while. I certainly didn't know that when I was 8 or 9 or even in high school. So yeah, just this kid who was trying to do well in school. And eventually I went to the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School of Business, studied business, worked for General Electric for a couple of years, and then I entered the Jesuits. But yeah, I was a nice kid, but I don't think I was thinking any big ideas, that's for sure.
So what was it that led you to study business? What was the bit of the thread you were pulling on?
Yeah, well, my dad was in business, and pretty much all the families I know on the street, the fathers, not the mothers at this time, this was in the 60s. I mean, some did, some were teachers, but the fathers all went to work. And so we didn't have a lot of money. And when I went to college, I thought, well, you have to get a job. So what's the best thing to do? To go into business. And I studied finance, and I did well and ended up at this great job at General Electric, formerly a great company. But there was really, I say this in the book, there was really no one, and I've said this in several of my books, there was really no one to say, what do you want to do with your life? Like, what would make you happy? What are you called to do? The idea of a vocation, never anyone asked me that. I mean, my parents were, how do you like business? And, well, you seem to be good in business, and why not do that? They weren't against it, but it was a very, and I don't mean to denigrate them at all, but, we didn't have a lot of money. They were Depression era babies. And so had to make a living. And so that was the most practical thing I could do. But eventually I didn't really like it.
I've heard you talk about that time as there's this little vignette that made me really sad of you being at your desk writing, I hate my life on a piece of paper.
Yeah.
Sounds like you were quite ill.
Yeah, I mean, I only wrote it once. So, but
it wasn't like mementos
like
all over the walls.
Like all over the walls, right? No, look, I mean, basically what happened was this. I studied at Wharton at Penn. I had a great time at the University of Pennsylvania. I did. And it was fascinating. Business is fascinating. I mean, I knew nothing about it. This was in 1982, I graduated. I was a yuppie. You're familiar with that term. Young urban professional. I was in New York in my 20s, making a ton of money.
Doing quite a lot of clubbing. Is that right?
Yeah, well, as you will see how much when this new book comes out. Yeah, a lot of
it.
Well,
I went clubbing a lot in my youth. I think there's something ecstatic about it.
I'm in my 20s and drinking a lot, and it was exciting. It was exciting. I was a yuppie. But what happened was I took a job at another section of GE in GE Capital in finance. And it just got more and more stressful. And I just thought, what am I doing? I don't really like this. It's not really interesting. Business is a real vocation for a lot of people. And I just couldn't see a way out. I thought, well, I'd studied business. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? And there was really no one to kind of encourage me to think more creatively. And I felt stuck. And one night I came home and saw a TV show about the Trappist monk, Thomas Merton, the American Trappist monk. And I just blew me away. Just the whole idea of the monastery and prayer, and about which I knew zero. I had no idea who Thomas Merton was. I mean, I knew there were monks and they prayed. And I don't know what they do, what else they do. And that really just was so romantic and so beautiful that was what drew me. And, looking back, I'm not sure, depending on who's listening, this is how God calls us. God calls us mainly through these attractions and desires. From a simple point of view, like if you are a business person, you love business, you're going to be drawn to that, or an attorney, or someone who works in radio or podcast or religion, or even in terms of marriage, that's how it happens. People are drawn together. It's a call, and that's how it worked for me.
Had you been going to church this whole time? How much had the faith that you'd inherited from your parents been a kind of live part of your identity through that whole period? Kind
of on and off. I mean, I didn't go to Catholic school ever. In elementary school, junior high school, in elementary school, I went most Sundays. My parents weren't super religious, but if we missed mass, it wasn't the end of the world. Junior high school and high school, most Sundays. College, when I wasn't too hungover, I would go to mass. At GE, most Sundays, but I really, that's all. I went to mass, and I don't think I ever talked to a priest outside of mass, ever. I mean, they would visit our homes in the 60s, something called the block collection, going to different blocks and asking for money. The priest would visit you. And it was very awkward because I didn't know any priests. But no, I was a kind of lukewarm Catholic, I sometimes call myself. And all my friends were shocked when I told them what I was doing.
And what was the hunger? What was it about it that made you feel that I hate this life, I might love that life?
Well, it was a push and a pull. So I did hate that life. So it was pushing me. So that wasn't some big discernment. I didn't like it. I was stressed out. I was getting all these stomach problems. I was getting migraines. I was just stressed. It was like almost 24/7. And the pull was this other life, whatever it was that Thomas Merton seemed to represent, seemed so romantic, so beautiful. It just seemed so beautiful, like life in a monastery and helping people. And then I stumbled across the Jesuits. Someone randomly said you should talk to the Jesuits, which are a Catholic religious order. And that seemed to fit. I didn't think I'd be a monk because as you can tell, I talk a lot. But that's how it sort of, God writes straight with crooked lines, as the proverb says.
And I do not come from a Catholic background. I think I had a sense of what a priest is, and I kind of knew what a monk was, but I am being slowly introduced to this whole new world of different religious orders, like the Jesuits. What is a religious order?
Yeah. So I often say to people, most people know parish priests. They get that. A parish priest, he's ordained. He works in the parish. He's under the bishop in the diocese, right? Sometimes they become bishops, and et cetera. There's another way of being a priest or a brother, which is by living in community together. We take vows of poverty. So everything goes to the community. Chastity, we don't get married. Obedience, we're told kind of where to go, and we are living together, right? It's not in a rectory, but in a religious community. So the ones that people would know would be the Franciscans. They're a religious order. The Dominicans, very big in the UK, of course. The Trappists, they're monastic orders, and it's kind of
quiet,
like,
right? The silent ones.
The silent
They're
ones.
the silent ones.
Yeah, the Trappists, but even more silent would be like the Carthusians. Really,
Right.
If you've ever seen the movie Into Great Silence, that was a great movie about the Carthusians. So it's just two ways of being a priest or a brother. And they're sisters, of course. There were women's religious orders. And they're all under the Pope, basically. They're the same. So I don't work in a parish. You can see this office. I work in a magazine. most Jesuits are known for working in schools. So a lot of the schools in the UK and parishes in the UK, and Farm Street, is our big parish in London and whatnot. So we do all sorts of different things. But the key is we live in community. We take those vows. We were founded by St. Ignatius Loyola. And we also do a lot of retreat works and spirituality.
So I should confess, the reason I've got interested in all of this is that this house that I'm sitting in is a very small experiment in intentional community. So my husband and kids and I have moved in with another family and we've turned the garage into a chapel, and we do kind of morning prayer and evening prayer, and we have a rule of life, and we're trying to do sort of rhythms of prayer and hospitality. But none of us have, we're bodging this together from books and podcasts and like helpful modern translations of the Rule of St. Benedict, not the original because it's too hard to read. But it's a kind of recent interest in my life, this kind of monastic understandings of how we live together. What does it mean to love each other? What does it mean to grow together? And I think in this moment, whether you're religious or not, the sort of trust crisis, loneliness crisis, housing crisis, climate crisis means there's an openness to the possibility that this tradition might have something to teach us, that this way of living might have something to teach us. Whilst at the same time, certainly in the UK, like I think membership of religious orders is going right down. Do you see something changing in the way people think or talk about this, or is there always a bit of interest and it holds sort of steady across time?
I would say the latter. I think there's always a bit of interest. I think there is a lot of loneliness in society today, and there's a lot of isolation. And so people are looking for community. That's a big word. I'm sure you hear that on your podcast all the time. I think the difference is for the Jesuits, it has a purpose, and it's, serving God, carrying out God's will, doing charitable works, those kinds of things. And in a sense, the thing that makes it kind of easier for us than I think it's harder in your situation is that there is this organizing governing principle, and we have vows of obedience. And so when we have the superior of the community who says, we're going to do this, and we do it, right? It's not blind obedience, but the idea would be, okay, Jim, now you've been at America magazine for 25 years. Now I want you to go work at this parish. And so there's a kind of structure there as well. And we don't say no because, we take this vow of obedience. We believe that God's working through this. That's the challenge in a situation like yours, because like who's in charge and who says what time we're eating dinner, and who says how the kitchen's always a big thing. Who says how the dishwasher is unloaded or not unloaded. I'm sure you're smiling because I know you've been through all this.
It's because it's the biggest argument we've ever had over the dishwasher.
Absolutely. And one of the easy things about living in a religious house is the tradition, and this is how we do it. And okay, fine. You buy into that. So it's actually, I think it's harder for families to do it. And we've also been doing it for 450 years. So we've got some, it doesn't always work, but we've gotten most of the kinks out of it, right?
Yeah, you sort of know all the things that can go wrong.
Yeah, and oh yeah, definitely. And also all of the money goes to, like my salary goes to my community, the end. I don't see any of it. And I get what I need from my community, but there's no money arguments in our house.
Hi, I wondered if I could ask for your help. You may have noticed that we've been doing a lot of work behind the scenes to make this channel more beautiful, more enriching, more thought-provoking, and more life-giving. But 87% of you watching on this channel are not yet subscribed. So I wondered if you would just hit the little subscribe button. It means that you'll get these really thoughtful conversations in your feed, and it will also help other people find us. Thanks very much. So this is quite personal, but I get asked this question a lot. What is the hardest thing about living in a religious orders
chastity,
community?
Definitely. I mean, it can be lonely, and you don't have a exclusive relationship, as we call it, and lack of intimacy, physical intimacy. That's definitely the toughest. Anyone who tells you otherwise is not being true. But by the same token, I live with wonderful people. I have tons of friends. I have a lot of love in my life, and it works for me. And I think if I were in a relationship, I think I'd actually get bored. I think I kind of know myself well enough. Poverty is not as difficult, except at times. And I've never found obedience difficult, frankly. Obedience mainly in the Jesuits is, we want you to work here. That's what the obedience, that's how it comes down to. So no, I think chastity is the hardest.
Thanks for raising that. It's down on my list of questions because reading your writing, honestly, it felt like, and obviously there's lots that I won't have read, but it felt like one of the few times I've heard that spoken about with such honesty and actually such tenderness. You know, there's the ways the public conversation about priestly chastity is either this sort of salacious, icky, overly interested, you know, or the like, but it is God's call and it is pure and there is no problem. And I guess why do you feel able to talk about it in public, and what are the healthier ways we could narrate it?
Yeah, because as I've lived it for 36 years, I often say to people, do you have any aunts or uncles that are unmarried? Oh yeah, so-and-so. Any cousins? Oh yeah. Like, are they crazy? No, they're just unmarried. Why are they unmarried? They've chosen to be unmarried, or things didn't work out, or they're widowed. Are they nuts? Are they like sick? No. So I think the idea that needs to be kind of reminded. I often remind people that. I was like, do you have any aunts or uncles that are unmarried? Oh, sure. They're wonderful. Are they loving? Oh, I love her. She's wonderful. Is she a loving part of your family? Oh, she's amazing. In fact, the kids love her more because she has more time. It's like, yeah, that's kind of what we're getting at. But the idea that people would choose it just kind of freaks people out. So I think it's just important to talk about it honestly. But yeah, there's the two, you've identified them very well. The two strains are, that's crazy, no one can do it, you're sick, you're whatever, or, oh, you're so holy and you're a saint. And, you know, it's just as wrong to talk about motherhood that way. Oh, mothers are saints, or, oh, you know, mothers, they're so dysfunctional and they screw up their kids. And so it's another way of living in the world, another way of loving, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I want to talk about your vocation in particular as someone shaping the public conversation. At what point in your journey did you think, actually, I need to use my voice in public? Or were you told to by your order?
So I went through what's called formation, Jesuit training. We call it formation because you're formed. And what did I do? I studied philosophy at Loyola University, Chicago. I worked for 2 years in East Africa with refugees, helping them start small businesses. I came back and worked at America Media for a year. We worked full time during our studies. I studied theology for 3 or 4 years. I forget how long. And then I was assigned to work at America Media. And pretty much from the get-go, you're writing articles and I was writing books. So from the beginning after ordination, I was kind of contributing things, I would say, in the public square. And then recently, I started to do more work with the LGBTQ community, starting about 2016. Most of my work has been writing books about spirituality and prayer and the saints, things like that. A little more mainstreamy than the more recent work that I've done, which has brought me much more into the public eye.
What prompted that in 2016? What happened?
The Pulse nightclub massacre happened, which you may remember in 2016. 49 people.
Is that Miami?
Yeah, Orlando.
Yeah. Orlando,
at a nightclub. And I felt that the church's response was really pretty pathetic. And I thought, if this were any other group, we would be saying how we should pray with them and having masses for them. And I did a Facebook post that went viral. It went viral was a good thing, pre-pandemic. And then that led to a talk and a book called Building a Bridge. And that led to this ministry, which we're talking about discernment before. Each step I was discerning, is this the right thing to do? Is this the right thing to do? Should I do a Facebook post? Should I do this talk? Should I do this book? And then I got invited to give all these talks, and there was a lot of pushback. Then I was invited by the Vatican to give a talk at a World Meeting of Families in Dublin in 2018. And I met with the Pope in 2019, and he supported the work, and it just sort of took off. And now we have this ministry called Outreach. Our website is outreach.faith. And we're even having an event, which I can say, at the Synod, during the Synod in Rome in a couple of weeks. So that's been interesting. That's been a real shift in my life. And it's not something that I planned. It just kind of happened. But I discerned each step of the way, and also asked for permission each step of the way. I think most people now today, they know me at all. They know me more for the LGBT stuff. And I've become this figure of, it's just the strangest thing. This boy who was like biking to school didn't expect to be this person that everybody either hates or loves. It's very strange. Protests. And so.
So this might reveal my naivety, but, you say you ask for permission every step of the way, presumably because there's a lot of people that would see this as a change or in opposition to Catholic teaching. There must have been some turbulence internally about your identity and your sense of belonging and the possible costs of this.
Well, yeah, I didn't really expect, when I wrote this book, I wrote a book called Building a Bridge, and it's very small. It's 120 pages. And I thought it'll be what we call in the United States a one-off. It'll be used by parishes, and I'll move on to my other stuff.
Yeah, go back to writing about the saints.
Yeah, which I actually feel much more comfortable about. My new book is called Come Forth. It's about Lazarus, and that's kind of what I feel more comfortable doing. I'm not a controversialist. I really hate that kind of stuff. But at each step of the way, I felt like this was the right thing to do. It is the right thing to speak up for LGBTQ people, for whom very few people are advocating in the Catholic Church. I thought that was really important. And so when I asked for permission, it was more that's a very astute question. It was more that I knew that as a Jesuit, it would affect other Jesuits. And so I'm part of a whole, and I can't just strike out on my own and do what I want. And even though I felt that it was the right thing, I needed to say to my superiors, I'm going to do this. Does this make sense? Yes, that's fine. And sometimes they say, no, we don't want you to do that. And that's the benefit of doing all this from within the church, is that I think I have more of a voice. The negative is that sometimes they say, no, you can't do that. So it's kind of navigating that. So that's where the obedience comes in. That's a new kind of obedience for me. It's kind of checking with people and making sure it's okay.
Yeah. So, you say you're not a controversialist, and I sort of, reading and listening to you, I can just hear that your tone and posture is not like someone who's really up for a fight. But this position has, like, when I was doing my deep dive research, searching and listening to podcasts and videos, and half the entries are these very lovely, devotional, long form things on the Examine, and that's you speaking. And then half of them are this terrible heretic works of Satan. I don't need to repeat it all to you. Like bile, real.
Yeah, they're really mean.
Feel very strongly about it.
Oh, they do. Yeah. It's really a strange thing.
How have you navigated that personally and spiritually?
Well, it's actually an easy question to answer because I think about it all the time. I was on a retreat years ago, like 7 or 8 years ago, and I was praying about a passage called The Rejection at Nazareth. And so for those people who aren't Christian or don't know the Bible very well, it's about Jesus preaching in his hometown of Nazareth. He preaches, and initially everybody thinks he's great. And then he starts to say, well, you're probably going to say, do miracles here like you did somewhere else. And prophet is not welcome in his own land. And they start to get angry at him. They get so angry at him, they chase him out of the synagogue, and they drive him to what's called the brow of the hill to throw him off, i.e. they try to kill him, which is usually kind of downplayed when we talk about this. And I remember praying about this. In the Jesuits, we have this tradition of imagining yourself in a scene. I mean, literally just picturing yourself and trusting that what comes up is maybe what God wants you to look at. And I imagined myself in the scene, and I imagined asking Jesus, like, how could you do this? Like, how could you know what they were going to say? Like, you come up and you say, I'm the Messiah. And what I heard in prayer, not orally, but what kind of came up to me was Jesus asking me in prayer, must everyone like you? That was a big, and remember we were talking about when I was young, how that was a big thing for me, right? Getting everyone to like me. And it is for everybody at that age. And I had to admit to myself, I needed to be free of that. So that's the first thing. Not everybody's going to like me. Second thing is I have the support of the Pope, of the Jesuits, of my brother Jesuits. I do everything within the church. I remind myself of that. And then the third thing, I think it's the right thing to do. And people are going to push back. They didn't like our model in this is Jesus. And they don't like Jesus. A lot of people didn't like Jesus. And then there's a lot of homophobia out there, and I have to kind of ignore it. I'm used to it now. It's still, I'll be honest, I don't talk about this too much. It's still very weird for me because, I go about my daily life and I give a talk at some place and, there's like 100 protesters. And I just think, me, you're upset about me? And people think I'm devious and deceitful and all this. I've never challenged church teaching. I'm basically just trying to get people to listen to LGBT people. But people feel very strongly about it. When I was at the synod last year, it's supposed to be a big gathering where everybody listens to each other. One delegate refused to sit next to me and he left. He was so angry. And I was like, look, dude, I didn't say this, but even if you think I'm a sinner, right, you're supposed to sit next to me. Like that's the Gospels. So look, the other thing we have to remember is this. Most of the people there might be people who would disagree with me and say, I'm not sure about that. But the people who get enraged, a lot of it's their own stuff. It's something going on inside of them about their own sexuality. And I've had enough people write to me, believe it or not, saying, 5-10 years ago, I was against you, but I've just come out, etc. Right. So there's a certain psychological makeup of the person who's just enraged.
And I'm really interested in these. There's the sociologist who calls it mutual radicalization, the way in which disagreement and difference kicks us into fight or flight. And when someone attacks us and we react defensively, then they attack and we sort of harden into these extreme positions. And I sort of see Jesus' teaching in the New Testament around turning the other cheek and loving our enemies as these amazing sort of countervailing practices. But I know I've had very, very much radically less than the abuse that you've had. But in the instances where I've experienced something similar, the reaction in me is really like,
I mean, that you're a human being.
Frankly, screw you. Like, these are the reasons you're stupid and wrong.
Yeah, I mean, you're a human being. And I sometimes feel that interiorly. But, I did something really interesting over the last year. So I'm a member of the Synod, which is for not even a lot of Catholics may be familiar with it, but it's a worldwide gathering of people to help the church move ahead in terms of its governance and looking at different issues. And we met last year for the first time, 350 delegates. We're meeting in October of this year. And it's to really help Pope Francis make his decisions. It's very consultative. They call it the largest consultative gathering in world history, which it probably is, because it asks people from every parish in the world, right? There are Catholics everywhere. Yeah. Anyway, when I was there was the LGBTQ issue came up. And let me tell you, the stuff people said, some people, most people were quite open and welcoming, but some people were really just, I said to someone, you can get arrested in the States for hate speech for saying some of these things. So what I did was I really sought them out. I really tried to talk to them face to face. And then over the past year, I did a little project, off and on, where I would meet with them on Zoom or email or just in person. And I wrote an article about it that just came out at outreach.faith, which is our website, and America Media, on that process and what I learned and what their objections were, and also what my responses are. So it is possible. It's hard, though. It's hard when people tell you. I had an African archbishop say to me, the only reason people are gay in my country. Now imagine you have to be polite to everyone you meet, but certainly at the synod, certainly to an archbishop, as a priest. The only reason people are gay in my country is because Americans like you come and pay them to be gay. So you have to just, okay, Archbishop, let's talk about that. And really? So it's hard. It's a lot of work, but we have to become good listeners and good friends before we can tackle the tough stuff.
Yeah. It's not just sexuality, is it? I think the Catholic Church is in a moment of increasing division, and that's just mirroring societies across the world. The Church of England is in similar at each other's throats about sexuality. What is your hunch about what is driving some of these dynamics that are pushing us apart?
Well, one thing I want to say, because I know your audience, one of the most helpful insights came from I'm sure you know Father Timothy Radcliffe, who was the former Master General of the Dominicans, who gave brilliant talks. They're collected in a book called Listening Together, I think. And he quoted St. John Paul II. I'd never heard this before. And the quote was, it really changed my mind about the synod and what the goals were. Affective collegiality precedes effective collegiality. So affective collegiality, friendship, precedes any effective collegiality or discussion. You cannot really talk about these tough things without being friends. What is driving it? I think a lot of it's driven by politics and politicians, right, who are increasingly vituperative and us versus them. I think social media has a lot to do with it. People can say whatever they want and put out all sorts of lies. I also think, though, that, I would say two things. In the United States, I think a lot of it's a racism. I know this sounds very specific, but I think when Barack Obama was elected, people were very upset, and a lot of racists thought this can't be happening. The influx of migrants in all different countries, which is a legitimate challenge. I worked with refugees in East Africa. So it's a challenge, like to host, hundreds of thousands of people. But demonizing them is not the way to go. This is not Christian. And I think really certain political actors, I'm trying to be careful not to mention names, have made it okay to hate people again. Yeah. And I think it's really sad. And we are, remember we were talking about discerning spirits earlier in the conversation? That is not coming from God. Anything that is making people, demonizing other people, making them into like animals, literally calling them animals, is not coming from God. And that's not Christian. So I think it's okay to hate people again publicly. And we have to work against that.
Where's the line? I think about this a lot because I'm sort of listening across different, radical, empathy, temperance. And honestly, I think a lot of this is personality. Like so much of my theology and philosophy maps onto my temperament. And I think that's true of most people, rather than being like, the outcome of a rigorous intellectual exercise. But I am aware that, well, partly I just annoy people because I'm seen as like wishy-washy, fence sitter. But how do we hold together that posture towards others? And we would share a kind of Christian commitment to people being made in the image of God and a commitment to wanting to protect their dignity and to name their value and their beauty and their vulnerability, actually. And then holding lines on things that need lines held around.
That's a very good question. I was just thinking about that yesterday. We were having a discussion here at America Media. You don't want to demonize people who vote for one side or the other, but you also want to call out things that are actually wrong, right? So demonizing migrants and refugees, calling them animals, right? In the United States, saying that you're going to basically become a dictator. There's some things that there are some lines that you should not cross. I think part of it is not demonizing the person. That's what I try. Anytime you say he is like this or she is like this or you are like that. But I think
this group of people are all X.
Yeah, well, right. Anyone who votes for this person, anyone in the United States right now, if you vote for Donald Trump, you're racist. If you vote for Kamala Harris, you are a baby killer. Basically, those kinds of things. But it is important to call out the things that are said and to say this is not in keeping with, certainly for me, Christian values or even moral values. I really do. So I struggle with that. Like, what is the line? Now, as a priest, I try to stay out of politics. That's very important, right? We're not allowed to endorse, and I think that's reasonable. I don't want to split my congregation. By the same token, we have to say, look, there are certain Christian values: love, forgiveness, charity. That sounds pretty wishy-washy, but also welcoming the stranger. Sorry, if you don't like it, take it up with Jesus, right? Helping the poor, helping the sick,
visiting the prisoners. And, even Jesus, one of the lines I like, I think it's Matthew 5.
If you call anyone a fool, a raka, you will be liable to the fires of hell. And people say, oh, that we can't take that. So Jesus is saying, if you call people names, you're going to go to hell. It's pretty blunt. And people just pass that by. So, for me, it's the gospel. And if the gospel has political implications, so be it. But I don't set out to be political.
Yeah. I'd love to hear about Come Forth. What is the thesis of your newest book?
I'd love to talk about Come Forth. Here's the beautiful cover of Come Forth, also available in the UK. So it's a deep dive into the story of the raising of Lazarus, which is in John's gospel. For those people who don't know, two sisters, Martha and Mary, two very outspoken, wonderful sisters in the gospel, send word to Jesus that their friend Lazarus, their brother Lazarus is ill. Interestingly, they call him he who you love is ill, which is very beautiful. Jesus waits, he comes, they take him to the grave, the tomb actually, and there's a stone there. He says, take away the stone. He calls out, Lazarus, come forth. And the dead man comes out. It's traditionally called Jesus' greatest miracle. So the thesis of the book is it's a combination of spirituality. So what does it mean? What does that story mean for our everyday lives? Biblical exegesis, like looking at the text and what does it say? A little bit of a cultural history of Lazarus through the years, through the centuries. And then a travelogue. I go to the place where it happened. But it's really basically, what are we called to leave behind in our tombs? And in a sense, let die. What are the things that keep us from hearing God's voice, who is calling to us every day, come forth, into new life? So what do we need to let go of? What do we need to let die? Resentments, grudges, disappointments, old ways of being, anger, negativity in the tomb, sort of metaphorical tomb, and hear God's voice calling us to new life. So that's the thesis.
Obviously, one of the most famous bits is that the shortest verse, Jesus wept.
It's actually, I have a whole chapter on that, Jesus wept. And one of the interesting things, which might blow your mind a little bit, it blew my mind, is that the Greek word, so the New Testament is written in Greek. When you go back to the Greek words that are used around that passage, Jesus wept, actually are more words that are used about anger. So he's clearly sad about this friend's death, but there's a bit of anger and frustration.
Huh.
And Jesus, and the word that is used is it's the word that's used for a horse snorting. And
wow.
And he was deeply perturbed and moved in spirit, and he wept. So it's, I go over through the chapter, why is he angry, right? Is he angry at people's disbelief? Is he angry at the fact of death? Is he angry because he knows this is going to lead to his death? Because interestingly, in John's gospel, and this to me makes sense than the synoptic gospels, the reason he gets this great triumphant entry on Palm Sunday was because he's just raised someone from the dead. And the reason that people want to kill him is this. So there's a death-life pattern. Lazarus' death leads to his life, leads to Jesus' death, leads to new life. And so that passage, I have a whole chapter on it because it's very shocking to people that he would have. Now, we don't know. This is also being sort of translated from the Aramaic. We don't know exactly, but it's good to go back to the Greek and try to puzzle out some of these things. Jesus wept. And there's a challenge there. But the key is, he's human. He shows emotions. And we're uncomfortable with that. We're very uncomfortable with a human Jesus. He weeps. He learns. Boy, you say that and people get very upset, right? There's some things in the Gospels he seems to know. The theological, this is just to sort of tease people's minds.
No, I love it.
The theological conundrum is this. I believe that Jesus is fully human and fully divine. It's the great mystery. Jesus is the mystery. And anyone who says they have Jesus down pat, they don't, because he's always bigger than our conceptions. We can't get our minds around that.
Yeah. What have you learned about how to be people who can navigate divides and deal with difference without dehumanizing people who disagree with us?
Well, there's some Jesuit wisdom to be brought to bear at the very beginning of what's called the spiritual exercises, St. Ignatius's great spiritual text, kind of mapping out of a 4-week retreat. He has something called the presupposition. It's supposed to undergird everything. And you would think the presupposition is, oh, God's in charge, or we should always pray to Mary, or we should do X, Y, Z. The presupposition for the spiritual exercises is always give people the benefit of the doubt about what they're saying.
Wow.
That's the presupposition. Always try to put a positive spin on things. And if you don't understand it, ask. So that's really powerful for me. That's the first thing as a Jesuit. Always try to give people the benefit of the doubt. And then the second thing is as I learned this year, be comfortable listening to people that you disagree with and try to really understand where they're coming from, because they're human beings. But by the same token, have a sense of where your lines are. You know, if someone says, let's say something crazy. I am fearful of losing my job with migrants coming in, or I'm fearful that the government's resources will be diverted to migrants because my family is so poor. You could say, I understand. I understand. That's a real fear. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about what migrants actually bring to the country and how they actually help the economy. And let's go back and forth. If he says, I think all migrants should be killed, I draw the line, right? So there are lines that I think we need to kind of be clear about, but we also have to listen to where people are coming from. It's challenging. You know, Jesus does this. He listens to people. Of course, I mean, it's easier when you're the Son of God and you can raise people from the dead. But that's our task. And we do it imperfectly, but we have to do it, because not to do it at all would be, I think, the end of civilization.
Yes. Father James Martin, on that note, thank you so much for speaking to me for The Sacred.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Reflecting on that episode, I'm really left with the sense, again, and I'm always banging on about this, of how much we are formed by our childhood and what is imaginable and unimaginable in our childhood. And obviously there was some Catholicism in Father James's childhood, which presumably made it easier later on to decide to become a Jesuit brother and priest. There was another big story that led him in another direction first, which was about what a man is. You know, when you're raised in that kind of suburban middle class, because of the Brady Bunch background that he was, he says all the fathers were in business. When you're a young boy growing up thinking, okay, what is a good life? What is the path? What is imaginable and unimaginable? What the adults around you are doing and the range of different lives that you see up close really shapes your choices, right? We call it choice architecture. Charles Taylor calls it the social imaginary. And so Father James wanted to kind of follow in the footsteps of that script that had been laid out for him, and ended up in business and absolutely hating it. You know, he was drinking a lot and clubbing and having a lovely time, but he writes quite movingly in his memoir of actually being really quite ill, unhappy, physically and mentally unwell, and how I think it must have taken a lot of courage, actually, to step away from that life. I think so many people that we meet that are very embittered and very unhappy and very turned in on themselves maybe have found themselves in not dissimilar situations, but haven't known how to make a different choice, haven't known how to set out on a different life. So yeah, one of the purposes I maybe hope this podcast serves is just to help you listen into lots of different lives. It's one of the reasons raising our kids in community feels, quite risky on lots of levels, but hopefully also a positive for our kids is they're up close with a wider range of lives than they would just be if they were living in the nuclear family. And that really helps us, I think, discern what our own vocation might be more easily. Second thing, and it won't be a surprise to regular listeners that I'm very much on the same page with James about how we respond to difference. What actually can we do when we encounter these very knotty, very painful differences? And in Father James's case, it's around what should approaches. Interestingly enough, it's as far as I can just tell, and I'm not an expert, as far as I can tell, it's not actually on the substantive issue. It's much more on the posture. He's wanting to spend a lot of time listening to queer people and creating spaces of relationship and connection within the Catholic Church. Whether it's that or, you will have your own examples. It might be around race. It might be around abortion, it might be around particular political things, it might be around something within your faith tradition or your spiritual community or your philosophical gathering, or just in your friendships, right? Just in your family, that these moments where we're like, oh, wow, we are really, really far apart on this and actually incomprehensible to each other. That you really can't make any progress without focusing on the relationship. That there is no way through that except investing in the connection. In parenting, we say connect before you correct. That attempting to argue someone into your position by telling them how terrible and wrong they are, it's just bad comms theory. It doesn't really work. And that line is sort of classically highbrow way of putting it, but affective, as in about the affects, the emotions. So let's say emotional. Emotional collegiality precedes effective collegiality, i.e., if you want to get anything done in a group, you have to have some level of alignment and relationship and mutual respect. He also said we have to become good listeners and good friends to be able to tackle the tough stuff. And I really think that's something it's always been hard, but we had shared institutions, habits, common spaces, a shared narrative that helped us with actually the annoyance and the awkwardness and the discomfort of being with people that disagree with us and are not like us. And many of those things have been stripped away to the point that lots of us just can't tolerate it. Of course, we can't be with someone who disagrees with us on something big. Why would you? Because obviously they're a monster. And that, I think, is a dangerous story that I could really hear Father James, even though, understandably, sometimes he's received a lot of abuse and those kind of things affect us. He's committed to this posture. Yes, many more things I could pull out, but I think I will leave you with those two things for today. Is there a sticky situation, a disagreement, a division in your life or work or wider group that you could maybe park the issue for a minute and work on the relationship? What would it mean to connect before you correct? Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Sacred. My name is Elizabeth Oldfield, and this is a project of the think tank Theos. Our production team are Dan Turner, Amari Gandrin, and Lizzie Harvey, and our music is by Luke Stanley. I really hope you'll check out Theos's wider work, including our sister podcast, Reading Our Times. And you can find me on Substack at morefullyalive.substack.com and in various places on social media. Speak to you next time.